Due diligence is not a new topic to anybody in this room, I'm sure, but I think the intelligence behind due diligence might be, in terms of the level of sophistication we have now, some of the data analytics, some of the industry smarts that companies are using to apply better methodologies to due diligence, informing themselves as compliance leaders, informing their business leaders. These are the things we want to get into now in kind of the age of AI and more digitalization and more expectations from company leaders that we're better and smarter about doing due diligence and how we handle third parties. This is what this expert panel is going to talk to us a little bit about today. I'd like to turn things over to Christian and his panel members who are representing FIFA and Microsoft and AECOM, and thank you for their time and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way to go on after a seminar on not being nervous when you're public speaking, So I'm lucky to be on a great panel about an interesting topic with a phenomenal set of panelists, but also that intro was just what I needed. I'm also an introvert, so I will be taking a nap after this session because this will be taking a lot out of me. So innovative technology and due diligence, it is in every part of our world, technology, right? What we watch on Netflix, what we search in Google or Bing for that matter, everything we do involves AI, machine learning, technology, automation. So it's no surprise that we see compliance officers trying to add that into their compliance program. So today we are going to have this panel discuss some of the innovative things that they do in their own companies. Hopefully there will be some tangible takeaways that everyone can use to bring back to your organizations. And also at the end of today's panel, we're going to allow questions, and they're encouraged. It makes the panels always go better. So to lay the foundation for today's discussion, I'm going to ask the panelists, starting with Ed, to give a brief background on himself and some of the challenges that they sought to solve using innovation and due diligence.
Certainly. So we're going to bring a little swagger to the group. But I'm Ed Hanover. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer at FIFA. So for those of you who aren't aware, it's Federación Internacional de Football Associations. So it's the world governing body for soccer. The position didn't exist prior to 2016, which probably most in the room who follow news is probably aware. So I was the first, and part of my task is obviously to build the compliance and integrity and ethics function at FIFA. My background is obviously I'm an American. I'm the only American on the management team at FIFA. So I'm consistently made fun of because we use the term soccer. We're one of 2 countries in the world that use soccer. All the other 209 use football. So I will use football today just because I've been so trained by it. But as an American lawyer, I worked at law firms in the United States. You know, my background is a defense attorney for pharmaceutical companies. So then I went in-house at a pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk. Ultimately moved to Europe. I was general counsel for emerging markets in Europe for many years. Then I moved to Singapore with Takeda Pharmaceuticals, did very similar work there. And then FIFA contacted me to see if I'd be interested in taking up the Chief Compliance Officer role. So I moved back to Zurich, Switzerland in 2016. So for the past 2.5 years, I've been building the program. And for me, I would say one of the key challenges that I've learned, especially now that most of my career, the past 10 years, has been outside of the United States, is really working hard to understand local conditions that your business units or your local legal teams are facing. So I've personally traveled to 46 countries for work, and it's amazing what you learn when you're on the ground, what the teams are really facing. And I take that information and to help make better decisions for the business and for the legal teams locally, because really it needs to be a collaboration. And the teams really feel it when you're there locally that you're trying to understand what's going on. So that's my long introduction.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Do you play soccer, Ed?
I do, but I played lacrosse in college, so I was more of a lacrosse guy.
But that's not a requirement for working.
They didn't ask me until about the 3rd interview if I even played any sports, so that was a good sign.
Janine?
So I am Janine D'Amico-Lemker. I am at Microsoft. I lead the Global Business Ethics Program in the Office of Legal Compliance. Similar to Ed, my background is a white-collar criminal defense attorney. I spent about 10 years practicing in DC and New York, representing companies under investigation or individuals who'd been either charged with or somehow affiliated with the federal justice system. I joined Microsoft about 7 years ago as part of the investigations function and have been running now the program for the past 3 years or so. For us, I think at Microsoft, and Alan will help me here in a minute, I think, One of the things that has become more and more challenging is the emerging types of third parties in which we work with and the relationships that we have with those third parties. And so at Microsoft, as we think about the breadth of our business, doing everything from selling you an Xbox and making that hardware, making tablets, to having resellers and distributors, people who build our data centers, general contractors, and then more and more the emerging risk of the way in which we are transforming digitally with our customers, where we actually are in a relationship where the customer and your customer really is at the center of our value proposition. It's not actually even our customer. And so us, our partner, and what has traditionally been thought of as our customer end up being in a partnership in ways that we had never seen before. That's really apparent when you think about the cloud, for example. And so trying to understand where some of the old work in terms of thinking about managing risk in the third-party ecosystem is successful, but how to adapt it for these changing relationships that we couldn't have predicted probably even 2 years ago.
That's perfect. And Alan's also from Microsoft.
Yeah, and just by way of introduction, I'm Alan Gibson. I also sit in the Office of Legal Compliance. I'm part of Janine's organization, and what I bring to the role is, I think, something a little bit different in that the first part of my career actually was in sales and general management. And so I was a business person for several years, we'll just leave it at that, before having a company that I sold to fund my dream of going to law school, where I got paid for doing deals. So I was a corporate finance, M&A attorney in private practice before landing out at Microsoft 15 years ago. During my 15 years at Microsoft, I've been in and out of legal, doing anything from being a frontline commercial attorney to doing biz dev work in the business and helping the company think about how we reimagine how we launch different products and online services. Janine hit on it briefly about how our business model is changing, and as I look at risk, and what I'm really excited about is we're really working at this intersection of legal, compliance, business, technology, and there's all sorts of new risks that we haven't imagined or we're having to address in new ways.
My name is Mike Costu. I'm the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of AECOM, which is a large engineering infrastructure company. I served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 9 years, and then I made my transition to what is a predecessor company to AECOM, and I served as a project engineer. So I had the opportunity to understand and learn an aspect of the business from the ground up and to, work closely with the project team to deliver a product. I did that for about 3 years. Then I transitioned into a compliance-oriented role in a particular part of the business focused on federal contracting before starting my sort of official compliance journey in around 2010. I've had the opportunity since then to observe what I think of as compliance programs in 3 separate life stages. So in 2010, probably around 2014, I worked for URS, and URS had not made a significant investment in diligence systems. The company had a strong culture and generally shied away from risky places, but had chosen not to make a significant investment in diligence systems. So that was an opportunity for me. The general counsel came around to the idea that we needed to do it, and so we took the plunge. That entailed talking with numerous stakeholders, and I quickly determined that it was in our best interest to develop a tool or procure a tool, a system that could accomplish many different things, that could serve as a supplier qualification system, that could enable us to evaluate third parties for human trafficking risk, and to serve as a traditional anti-corruption screening tool. And so I had the opportunity to develop that system, to make it our own, and to leave my stamp on it, if you will. Fast forward to a couple years later, when URS was purchased by my current employer, AECOM, and there I was fortunate to inherit, a pretty strong compliance program. The company had begun to make a significant investment in compliance systems. At the time, I think we had 3 or 4 diligence/information systems. The primary tool was a traditional third-party screening tool that had fairly elaborate workflows to determine, whether or not the chain of command and the lawyers that supported them wanted to engage with a particular third party. That was really a great set of systems that we had, but I nevertheless still needed to convince operations to use them the proper way, to really get their buy-in, and so that was my principal challenge for that life stage of the program. Fast forward then to the present day, essentially, or a couple years ago, and we determined that we wanted to go beyond those sort of basic systems and examine the data that we were collecting through our ERP in more detail. So we all have, various ERPs, and at least in the case of AECOM, we weren't really mining that data to look for patterns, to look for risky transactions, et cetera. So, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but we seized on the opportunity to collaborate with our audit team, which is really savvy about information, to develop sort of a next generation tool. I had been quite intimidated by that concept, or I should say I hear labels thrown about around artificial intelligence, those sorts of things, and it wasn't my background, so it was a little bit scary. But the tools are out there, they exist, that allow us to sort of make it much easier. There's drag and drop tools that allow you to sort of break down data science and make it accessible to the uninitiated. I think the tool that we ultimately chose was described as data science for dummies. And so we can do it. So that's my next challenge.
Your swagger. A little bit of swagger.
There's a couple of really good segues there. And Janine mentioned managing risk, and even when you implemented that new system, you had some new challenges. I think a question the people in the audience want to know, I want to know, is the goalpost moving with innovation? So essentially, we can innovate more. Are we just getting more insight and more data on risk, or is the goalpost moving? We're expected to find more. So I'll start with you, Janine, because you mentioned managing risk.
So I think the answer is a little of both. The answer is, first of all, yes, it is moving. I mean, we believe deeply and you have to at least see the horizon of it if you can actually catch up to it, in our view. But because your business is emerging, your business is innovating, so you have to stay current with that too as you think about how they're using their ecosystem. Like, what is the business proposition for your partner ecosystem, for your supplier ecosystem? But in terms of managing risk, I think for us, it's actually, I think we've sort of designed our data analytics program, which Alan leads, to manage in the first instance, known risk. And I think partially because, as we just heard, it can be very intimidating to think about what do you do with data. It's like this thing that's out there that people know they should think about and what to do with, but it's sort of a behemoth concept that not everyone finds accessible, frankly. So if you think about your current known highest risk and then work from that proposition forward to sort of look at that goalpost in the future. And so the journey that Alan will talk about, I think, is for us that started with transaction risk because we had certain data that was going to present those risks to us in a more seamless and seeable way, and then took that journey that led us then to using data to manage our third-party risk as well. And so I think hopefully that sort of answers where you were going, but I think that's why I think it's a little bit of both.
No, definitely. And Alan, to your credit, so you are Microsoft, you have a tremendous number of transactions that you are responsible for. How do you handle that volume of transactions? Are there insights that you're pulling out of it, things you're looking for? Kind of talk about the process at Microsoft involved with the transactions, the volume, and any risk analytics around that.
Yeah, and thanks. I'll just take a quick step back. So with our program, what we're really trying to do is use digital technologies to create an early warning and monitoring system for our compliance risks. As Janine and Christian mentioned, that we take a prioritized risk-based approach. And so for us, when we started on the journey, 3.5, 4 years ago, one of our most significant risks is our risk of corruption. And for Microsoft, our corruption risk becomes an issue when we enter into a bad deal with a customer or a partner. And so what we wanted to do is like, okay, where should we be devoting our resources to effectively manage our corruption risk? So we decided to focus on our deals. And with our deals, what we wanted to do was like, okay, let's see, where do we want to put our resources? How do we actually identify our highest risk deals? Imagine a world where any of our sales transactions, we could risk rank on a scale of 0 to 100. Above a certain risk threshold, we would then provide additional compliance oversight. So we spent between 6 and 9 months investing in a system that would basically risk score all of our sales transactions. Above a certain score, it'd be taken off of the standard or the happy path and would get additional review. And there were a lot of intermediate steps as we built out that process. It took us 12 to 18 months to really get it up and running. But the amount of learnings that we got from how we aggregated our data, the methodology that we came up with for developing algorithms, as important as it was to land the technologies or use the technologies, I spend most of my time talking about the special sauce of actually operationalizing it. And so, what we do is we take the data, create an insight, and then it's all about the action. What do you do with it? And that really takes us into our partners. So once we'd aggregated all of our deal transaction, one, we could start to aggregate it on a partner by partner type basis, but it also opened our eyes to what was possible in terms of how we would use our data. And so now we've created a similar approach with all of our channel partners is where we're starting right now, all of our reselling partners. And now we basically risk score all of our partners on a scale of 0 to 100 and decide which ones we want to provide additional compliance oversight to. I can walk people through what that looks like a little bit later.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's an important concept in this because I come from the technology side, and we tend to focus on things we do, analytics and technology, but really, we've had this conversation before, that's just the technology and the data is the trip to an end location, right? In itself, it's nothing. It's really, what are we making of this information and how is it impacting our risk? So it's good that we do this, but we have more decisions to make now that we know this information than we did before. And that's good because it protects our organizations, but it also causes more questions for us. And Ed, you almost have the opposite end of the spectrum. You are the first chief compliance officer of FIFA. So where Microsoft has been around, they've been doing this for a while, you're really starting from the ground up. So how's that challenge as far as building a compliance program from scratch and kind of going down that path from where you are now?
Oh, that's all of that is true. So, I mean, just to give you a little bit more insight on FIFA too, if you did the math, we have 211 member associations, which means FIFA is larger than United Nations. So just when you start to think about the scale and scope of what we do, it starts to get quite large. And we also are a bit different than most organizations that we have a revenue generation arm, but then we also have a development arm. So you can say we're a bit of a merger because I know potentially NFL's here. The NFL, but then also if you add the Red Cross. So we spend, most of our money gets redistributed back through the 211 member associations to be spent on projects to further develop football within the country. And there's lots of arms that we have to try to do this. So for me, coming from a company, I was used to the due diligence partners for the people that you were supplying you services. But I hadn't really considered the side on the development side. When you redistribute, FIFA redistributes almost $400 million a year in development funding. So it's a massive scale. And how do you start to risk score those projects to make sure that you're doing appropriate checks on the partners you're dealing with locally? And you can imagine, most of our projects are not done in Canada, United States, and Germany. They're done in South America, Africa, Caribbean, Middle East, Southeast Asia. So you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And then on the flip side of that, we also have sponsors, and some major sponsors, and actually some of the companies in this room are sponsors of FIFA. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure that we were creating an organization that sponsors were proud to be members with and partner with. So we want to make sure we're creating an environment, transparency, and comfort that our partners, our sponsors want to work with us. The local countries want to work with us. The stakeholders all want to work with us. So it is definitely an interesting task, and due diligence is key in that regard, because if we can show we have a process with our partners, it makes it a little bit easier for some of the sponsors to feel comfortable that what we're doing is on the modern side and not, you could say, on the old way of doing business side.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you have unique challenges as well, specific to FIFA. So one of the questions is, how do you do due diligence in those jurisdictions, which are, the U.S. and Canada, and also challenges, we discussed it, where you had, potentially a soccer player is on a sanctioned list or something like that, which probably no other organization is going to run into that challenge.
Yeah, that's all. We get most things at FIFA, I will say. So again, we spent a lot of time at the beginning really doing an assessment of our risk profile. So where do we see the risks? So obviously the development program, obviously the money coming in to the revenue side. I mean, just as an aside, the World Cup is the largest sporting event in the world. I'm sure everyone in this room probably has seen or heard of the World Cup. And just to give you, so you can understand the scale, I think for the Super Bowl, about 100 to 120 million people watch the Super Bowl live. Do you have any idea how many people watch the World Cup final live?
4 billion.
It's 10 times that. It's 1.2 billion watch it live. So we had 65 matches last summer for the World Cup in Russia. Every single match had over 120 million people watching live. So these are the types of, the focus, the extreme focus on what you're doing. I mean, coming from pharma, you could be saving lives. Nobody's interested in it. But when you are working in sport, it is amazing how any step, anything you do, people are super, super interested in what you are doing. So again, it was focusing on the collaboration. Like, how do you get people to the table to sit and speak with you so you can have the discussion, so you can conduct the due diligence locally. And before you can take that due diligence step, you really have to educate why you're doing it. And it's really to protect the reputation of everyone involved. So we spent 2 years, and I only wanted to mention one more thing because I've been going on a while. One of the ways we did this to try to drive education is we created a compliance summit for FIFA that we do in Zurich every year. So we invite everyone who's involved in FIFA around the world, all the member associations can send a member to FIFA, and we do a 2.5 to 3 day program where we walk through in detail all of the components of a modern compliance program, and we provide tools in 4 languages to every member that they can take back into the country. Because what we found is when you start taking this discussion and there's a recognition and an understanding of why you have to do something, it's much more receptive on that side to do it, as opposed to, FIFA's telling us we need to do this, not to, now we understand why this is important to do. So it's very expensive and it takes a long time to do something like that, but we see substantial returns. My first year, 40 member associations, give or take, went out of 211. Last year, 140. And keep in mind, it's a voluntary event, so it just shows you the focus is really increasing heavily in football. And this is something we want to keep driving so the conversation is going the way we want it to go.
I will volunteer to go if you want me to.
Yeah, we are looking to open it up to externals this year, so I suspect many will be interested.
So collaboration was a big part of your work at FIFA. So Mike, what areas, both internally or externally, but really internally, are you collaborating with other groups within your organization? And tell us about some of the work you've done on your transaction monitoring program and what groups you've needed to work with to get that done.
I think that I collaborate probably, with all of the functional leadership in the company. We certainly work closely with our internal audit group. We work very closely with our procurement team, such as it is. We definitely, have very close relationships with our safety team, because I find that there's sort of a synergy between their communications campaign and our communications campaign. Specifically about this continuous transaction monitoring tool, we partnered with our audit team who had somebody who, as I mentioned, was savvy about data. What they're able to do is to, every month, extract the previous 12 months worth of information from our ERP. That information is then transferred into a data environment, a software tool which, as I mentioned, markets itself as data science for dummies. In that software tool, we can then essentially link the information that we've placed there to a variety of databases, such as sanctions databases. And we can also screen the data for other risk factors, that we've identified. Common sense things like round dollar payments, the size of payments on invoices to third parties. And then from that process, we're able to identify what we deem to be our most high-risk transactions. And then we have a process that we go through collaboratively between ethics and compliance and our audit team to perform further diligence on those third parties to determine what sorts of risks they represent, how to mitigate those risks, and if there are any major red flags that we need to launch an investigation to get to the bottom of. I know this is sort of nuts and bolts information. I find this helpful. Hopefully you do as well, at least when I'm in the audience. But I think that it's really enabled us to look for sort of blind spots in our process. I mean, now this is an after-the-fact process in the sense that, we've already signed up the third party, that we're extracting data from our ERP, and, it's sort of the back end of the process, if you will. So I think we could improve it by connecting in our case, Salesforce to this sort of data, this software tool that kind of allows us to blend data from different places to do an analysis or beforehand to try and prevent, to identify red flags before we engage in a transaction. So there's definitely a lot more that we could do, but so we're not yet doing predictive analysis, and that's certainly our goal. But we are able to look at all of the transactions within the company, which is certainly not probably as big as Microsoft, but we do have, we probably interact with 50,000 or so third parties every year. We pay 500,000 invoices, and so it's a large number of third parties, relatively. And so finally we're able to get our arms around all of the third parties that we interact with to look for patterns.
At Microsoft, is it similar as far as interacting with internal collaborators? Is it audit, technology? You're a technology firm yourself. Who do you lean on when you're building your dashboard, and where are you getting the data from? Because data is the key that drives all of this, right? So how do you get that, and who do you work with to get that?
I'll answer the first half, and you can probably do the second half. So in terms of, we actually had sort of a beautiful synergy with finance as well. The journey Alan talked about where we sort of began this, really it started with Alan and a very tiny budget. It was literally a lawyer sitting in Steele who was given a little bit of money to go out and explore this as a concept. So despite the fact that we are a big technology company and clearly have deep investments in all of the things we're talking about, science, engineering, AI, et cetera, we had to prove the value to us of how to use those tools for compliance. And so, like probably many of you in the room, that is the journey you will be on, where you have very limited resources and you have very limited, meaning in people as well. So luckily for us, at the very same time, the finance team was challenged to think about the same thing. And we had already embedded ourselves for various other relationships, including our historic due diligence practices and processes and tools, our TGH infrastructure, all of that were relationships we had existing with finance already. They also had a small amount of resources at the time dedicated to data science and engineering, and so that was like our strongest ally. And I think it was one of the smartest decisions we made first, was figuring out who our strongest ally could be, because we knew we could never do this alone. And they had, I think, one of the single most important things, which was the data. They actually had already aggregated for purely finance reasons, whether it's SOX compliance or other things. They had already begun to create this data lake of information that had the very same attributes we would have wanted to look at. So revenue data, discounting data, who was the end customer? Is that a government? Is that an SOE? Is it a commercial customer? They already sort of thought about how to bring those together for different reasons. And so for us, that was the single greatest partnership we probably could have developed at the outset. And then I'll let Alan talk a little bit about how that journey continued.
Yeah, and so finance is a huge ally, huge asset for us, the way that we're organized, in that one, that they own the data, but they actually have an IT department that sits within finance, including a handful of data scientists that support what we're trying to do. In addition, now that we've been successful on our journey or making progress on our journey, the legal department has actually made an investment in data scientists to support our work. And really the way that we're structured is that we spend a lot of time thinking about the compliance risks, the themes and schemes, the sort of signals we want to look for to identify and predict our risk of non-compliance. And then we work with finance to ensure that the data is aggregated in our data lake. And finance are the folks that are actually going out and aggregating additional data for us. And then we put our layer of data scientists on top of it. I mean, it's funny now, when I started on this journey 3 years ago, I never thought I'd have any idea what a Bayesian inference was or a random forest. And 3 years ago, I mean, we've talked about data science for dummies. Is when I was asked about what we were doing by our general counsel, it's like, look, the statistics that I understand are on the back of a baseball card. I mean, people that know me know that I spend a lot of my time playing baseball. Beyond that, in business school courses, it's like sabermetrics and baseball cards. That's what I understand. And where we have gone and the skills that I think all of us really need to develop at some level, take the step and do the data science for dummies. Make friends with the people that understand visualizations. Not that you have to create them, but understand what's going on there. That'll serve you well. If it's a good spot, as the Microsoft guy, I do want to show one slide, just one slide.
We had to pull a PowerPoint.
I have to pull a
basically
PowerPoint.
required.
And so when we talk about this early warning and monitoring system for compliance risks, and really what we're trying to do with partners, to make it real for you, what we're actually doing is, we have our standard vetting and due diligence processes where we rely on third-party reports. And with that, it's like, how trustworthy is your partner? It's a step we all have to take. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So when we thought about creating this early warning and monitoring system, it's like, what other dimensions could we add to it? So we decided that we wanted to take a three-dimension approach to it. The first one being the traditional process. The second one, based on all of our experience working and reviewing deals, it's like, what risk is being created by our partners just based on the business that they're doing with Microsoft? We have millions of sales transactions with all sorts of data points associated with them. But then as we start to look outside of that, there's other data points that we can put on top of it in terms of discounting, market development funds, whether they are quote unquote good partners from a protecting our brand, from an anti-piracy perspective. All this can inform what our risk of non-compliance by a partner, what it may look like. And then finally, the business environment. What risk is just inherent in where and how a partner does business. And so it could be anything from Transparency International and the Corruption Perception Index with a Microsoft layer of a geo-risk assessment put on it. But then we can start to get an understanding of some of the market dynamics. Since we've aggregated all of this deal data, we can get an understanding of what our market share may be within a certain market, distributed across partners, distributed across certain SKUs, where we're incentivizing our partners, and get an understanding of what risk is being created by those partners within the market. We take all of that together in our fancy-dancy algorithm, and we create a risk score. And I kiddingly say fancy-dancy algorithm. To us or to me, it's like, wow, that's really impressive. To a true data scientist, it's like, oh, Alan, there's so much more you could do. But then as we apply some of the data science to it, it's like, well, actually, your signal that you're creating is pretty strong. It's pretty predictive of what's going on. And so that's been our journey. You see the data points across the bottom, the sorts of different data points that we look at. somebody can grab me, I'm happy to walk you through in more detail what we're doing.
Yeah, and it sounds like a consistent theme at Microsoft and what Mike was talking about. You are all the subject matter experts in compliance and third parties and due diligence. It's important to know the technology side, but don't underestimate your knowledge and expertise, because that's really what drives all of the innovation. And technology is really the tool for that. Is the way I would think about it. The question everyone, yeah.
Yeah, just one thing, Christian, to just build on that is really the value that we add to this process. And yes, we're a technology company, but a lot of people have these sorts of tools in their companies. Legal or compliance may not just have access to them yet, or they may not have asked. A lot of the data that we need to look at sits and resides in the business. It's just never been viewed through a compliance lens and really taking advantage of that. And we've found the business and finance to be super helpful to us when we say, hey, we'd like to identify these themes and schemes. How can you help us? And that's where we've gone.
Yeah, no, that's great. The question everyone wants to know, though, do they let you use Google at Microsoft? No, you don't have the answer.
Yes, I have an iPhone.
So Ed, we're aggregating all this data, we're making decisions, but what does that mean once we are able to do it? So in Mike's case, we used off-the-shelf software that we're able to customize our needs. In Microsoft, we have this team of data scientists. We're gathering all this information, we're screening and doing sanctions lists, but now there's the human side of this conversation, which is what do we do with it? Or we have more information, how do we process it? And it introduces a whole host of other considerations. That could be a completely other panel about the outside of the innovation, but now we're people that have to make decisions on this. So from that perspective, as a chief compliance officer, how do you feel about the innovation pushing the envelope to now we might be able to predict things we haven't in the past, which could be fun or could be dangerous.
Well, I mean, these are all very interesting questions. I mean, for me, as we get more data, I mean, to a certain extent, it gets you more comfortable, you can say, in your analysis, but still as the lawyer or compliance officer, you still have to make a decision, like what does your organization do? And I found, my current organization and previous organizations, I start to ask more questions, what do we ultimately want to accomplish here? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? Because if you consider, if you're organizing a tournament someplace in the world, you may have a limited opportunity for the use of suppliers or third parties, or sometimes you have to work with government agencies, and you can do all the due diligence you want, but if there's only one you can use, really you need to move from the due diligence to, okay, how do we manage this to get us comfortable and get the other side of the equation comfortable so we can go forward? Because FIFA, we're a mission-driven organization. Ultimately we want to support football, support and develop football around the world. So we need to make sure our processes are focused on that. And it's easy as a lawyer, as a compliance person, to get kind of caught up in process and say, we're gonna run so many due diligence processes, we're gonna get all of this data, but ultimately you're using the data to make a decision, and those decisions are still made by people. Yeah. And for me, one of the key things at my current organization, and I had done it in the past, was constantly bringing these discussions up at management team meetings. Because maybe in the room you've had the same experience. A lot of times when the tough decisions pop up with compliance questions, they want to dump it back on compliance or legal. Please make the call, tell me yes or no, tell me if I can do it. And I've been quite disciplined in pushing it back and saying, I can tell you from an ethical point of view or from a legal point of view, but really we need to ask, what is the goal? What is the purpose of this? And if this fits into our mission, we should feel comfortable to move forward. Because if you are a mission-driven company and you're transparent on what your mission is, that's what you should focus on. And of course you need to follow the law. But I found it make it easier if you kind of think where you want to go before you go into the due diligence process. It makes the discussions easier versus jumping into the due diligence. You get all the data, you find all the little nasty things, and then you're kind of making a decision, and you had a feeling it was going to go this direction anyhow at the beginning. And it's probably just better to take the discussion with business up front. All right, where do we want to go? Who's making the decision? Who do we need to get around the table? And let's be prepared for what we think the background check is going to show us.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Can I, if I could add to that sort of from our perspective, one of the reasons I think the 3 dimensions that we talk about is sort of helps in exactly this, is that at the end of the day, we're all going to manage risk, but we're never going to manage risk to zero. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, how do you illuminate what is that's going to make the difference so that you can get to the business objective effectively. So rather than trying to say, you're the no, nobody wants to be the no, it's frankly not our job in that way. It's actually to help do exactly what Ed's suggesting. So for us, the part of the soul of the program is actually to design effective controls for risk. So if you think about whether it's our transaction program or whether it's our partner program, it's using the data to illuminate who the risk really is, and then what types of controls, additional controls maybe, or baseline, would be effective to help us feel comfortable that we do have transparency, we understand who our ecosystem is, and we're doing business with people that we trust, and that they can trust us. And so literally in a very tactical way, we have mapped our partner life cycle. We've chosen certain partners as higher risk in terms of their population. We've mapped the life cycle and figured out along that journey, when a partner comes into our ecosystem all the way to when they leave, what parts of it are places where this information would be useful to illuminate better what the risk is, and then what to do about it at that time. So if you're going to make an investment decision, could you use the score and then the data sitting behind it to help you choose what types of controls? So my Nirvana future state, for example, on due diligence is we hardwire that. We run the algorithm across it. We've designed based on that risk what the suite of mitigation controls will be. And then the people in the decision-making process essentially have less options in a way. They're actually mapping into the hardwire of the system which control is mapped to which risk. So if your risk is sitting because of your country location and your high level of discounting and poor credit, there are certain controls that will help mitigate those. So you don't choose the less effective ones, you choose the most effective ones, and the system helps you do that.
Is there any concern, or how do you approach, when you do have a system like that, making it transparent? Because that's important in everything we do, right? Because the worst case scenario would be we turn on the switch and then we eliminate, it gives us answers that are not right, or we don't know why it's doing that, right? That's a real concern when we use technology. So how do you keep this technology transparent so you always know what's going on, so the machine's not in control? To Ed's point, Ed won't give you a yes or no answer. Machines are never going to give you a yes or no answer either. So what kind of techniques do you do? And even on the sanction screening side as well, you have fuzzy matching logic. You have all of these things built in. What are the techniques around implementing this technology, or controls that we use to make sure that T1000 doesn't come and clear all our alerts and
It's not
wipe
HAL.
out the human population?
We haven't actually put HAL in place.
Yeah, here, I'll take the first crack at it. You hear me talking about algorithms. Our algorithms are not a black box where a partner comes in and all of a sudden we give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down. We risk score them across a variety of attributes, and so people that are vetting partners know why they were risked at a certain level and the data that sits behind it. So there's a human that's involved at that point in time. The machine does not make the decision. A human makes a decision on it. When we look at the accuracy of our algorithms is, yes, we're Microsoft, so I'm lucky enough that we can send our algorithms out across a variety of data scientists to have them peer reviewed to ensure that we're not introducing biases into how we're reviewing deals or partners. The other thing is we move more and more to the use of artificial intelligence is at Microsoft we actually have what we call the Ether board. It's an ethics board that is actually reviewing our algorithms just to ensure that we avoid those sorts of problems and any sort of biases in what we're doing. There may be less concern with deals, but there's more and more concerns as we look at our partners, our suppliers, and other actors in our sales model.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And just one more question for each of you, starting with Mike, and then I think we will open up to questions. It's an open-ended question, either one. Have there been any insights through these innovations that you think would be helpful to the audience, that you found that was a wow moment that could help someone's compliance program? Or where is the next step? So you're all at different phases of compliance program and innovation and technology. What's next? We kind of heard Janine say, the one computer that's going to do everything for us. So what is the next goal past? We're screening for sanctions. We're doing our analytics. Where are we going from here? So either one of those. It's tough to, on the spot, think of the light bulb moment that I found and nobody else knows, but if you have it, everyone was going to want to know. So just put it out there.
Well, I don't know if this is particularly insightful necessarily, but to answer your question and also to pick up where you left off, one thing I didn't mention is that, after we do all this data analytics, it's critical to then depict it visually so it's more accessible to operations leaders, to leaders in general. And so, we then take this data and we depict it through Tableau. And so, you can literally see how often, certain hot words appear in contracts. You can click on the word and it takes you to the contract. You can see a heat map, geographic heat map as to, that quantifies the risk in a particular region based on the 14 risk tests that we run against our data. And so that promotes a meaningful discussion among the leadership about what your risks are and, frankly, whether you are weighting the risks properly. And that then leads to a good, vigorous discussion about what the real risks in the business are. So now you've, gone through the process of doing the data analysis, but then you've also taken the next step in depicting it to the leadership in a way that they can actually understand what it is you're talking about, and then really engage in trying to adjust the product, to reconsider, where we're doing business or with whom we're doing business, et cetera. So to me, that's really the next step, is making it presentable, making it accessible to leaders so they can really want to engage in what is otherwise considered a sort of, obtuse process or opaque process, I think, to most business leaders.
Yeah, people love visualizations in every respect, and if it can help us sell things internally, that's important as well. So the Microsoft, same kind of question.
Well, a perfect segue for me, because where I think it's going to go as we talk about the use of data, the use of visualizations, is I'm convinced that 3 years from now, there'll be this concept of a digital compliance office and a digital compliance officer. And what that means is making sense of all the numbers, the bits and the bytes that we are collecting right now, and be able to serve up meaningful insights in a way that our compliance professionals or business professionals can actually interpret it and take action off of it. We haven't talked about it, but I picture the day where we're having the conversations with our audit committees, whether it's about investigations or whether it is about deals, and you always get the question, is it getting better or worse, and how do you know? That we actually can answer that in a way that's easy to consume through the visualizations and the data, and be able to tell that story. I'm convinced that day is coming sooner rather than later.
That's interesting. It require more skill sets then too in that job.
Yeah.
Legal, business, technology.
Project management.
Yeah, project management.
Yeah. I'll briefly add to that by saying two things. One, when we put this into our first launch, if you will, of the risk score, the entity risk score, was through our existing due diligence process. We basically just gave people better information than they had ever had before to make the same decisions they had all along. The other thing we did at the same time, though, was brought scale. So whereas we used a rule-based approach to essentially decide what looked kind of like the risk, you were a government, you've serviced government and customers, you were in this level of a geography, you had this much revenue, and those were kind of rules, that toll gates you passed to get into the high-risk tier of our vetting processes. So first, we were able to bring scale. We could sort of narrow it to about 2,000 partners, frankly, in our rules-based approach. When we launched this, we did it on all transacting partners for a particular time frame. It was 210,000. So we were able to score exponentially more, which also was scary. Frankly, we had a lot of conversations where I was like, oh my God, what's going to be in the others? Two things. So this was to your question about something I didn't necessarily see coming. One was it actually validated that we didn't do such a bad job with the rules. The population that we had been looking at, in large part, had overlapped with what the algorithm felt was risk. So that was sort of okay, good job. We kind of at least thought that through pretty well. And that the amounts that we saw in addition, based on how we had defined these deep attributes wasn't like so massive that we couldn't consume it into the existing process. Those are both things I frankly spent a lot of time talking to the team about, like, you're gonna run this and there will be risk when you run it because we will know things and we have to do the things that and that was scary. So it was actually like a nice part of the journey to realize that I didn't have to fear that, frankly, as much as I thought I did. And then I would say, to answer your other question very briefly, I actually think it's using some of these same frameworks to think about culture. So how do you use data and effectiveness measurements to drive, a conversation about what do you have in ethical culture? And so while that's not necessary, I mean, it's of course in some ways tied to the partner ecosystem because our expectation of them is the same we should have for ourselves. But I think that's sort of the next frontier.
And Ed, so you gave an open invite to everyone in the audience for Switzerland next year's FIFA conference?
Yep, this
Coming.
fall. This fall.
What time is it? What day?
It'll be October, yep, in Zurich. It's a good time to come to Zurich.
So after that, what, either one of those questions,
Yeah,
where do
sure.
you see you going? Or?
I mean, I'll play off what Janine said because, I'm a firm believer there's going to be a strong convergence between compliance ethics and culture, and that compliance officers are going to be expected to provide greater insight and support to senior management because there's going to be a greater recognition that a good corporate culture drives value at a company. It's actually going to be a value addition to a company. And there's a whole life cycle for it. You become more attractive to key talents. You retain key talents. By having a strong corporate culture, you build trust within your organization. You can become a mission-driven organization, which in turn makes your intangible assets in your company more valuable. I mean, it becomes a beneficial cycle. And you're starting to see more discussion on this. And I think compliance and ethics is going to become a key part of that. So I step outside of the due diligence a little bit and just say compliance programs themselves are going to be much more important on driving corporate culture, and the boards themselves are going to be leaning on compliance programs to help with that discussion.
No, that's great. So anytime you can give an ROI to compliance, it's a win for us.
It's
right?
coming.
Stop costing us so much money, and you made us money. That's all great stuff. So I guess I'll open the floor to any questions to the panel. Yes.
I have a question. My question is, we did speak about using data. My question is about availability of data. In certain geographies, you do not have adequate information of enforcement, sanctions, as the case may be. And there is a long time for you to get the enforcement closed. So then you do not have data at the time the enforcement is ongoing, right? That's on one side. On the other side, while you rely on open source information for negative media, there is a right to forget due to privacy and other regulations as it's picking up at this point in time. So how do you use the data? See, you don't have access to data and you're not able to effectively use the data that is existing at this point in time considering the privacy and other concerns. How do you see this evolving over the next few years as things come up?
Sure.
That's exactly what I wanted to
So there's two questions. One is, in countries where data is unreliable, how do you make decisions? And then in countries with strict privacy laws, they have the EU right to be forgotten, where information needs to be removed from search engines, things like that. How do you even find the data? And my initial sarcastic thought was making tough decisions on unreliable information is like, that's the description of compliance officer, right? That's all we do all day. But if there's any thoughts on the panel, I'm happy to weigh in as well.
Yeah, the big piece for us is a lot of the decisions we make about our parties are now more and more being made based on the nature of our relationship that we have specifically with that partner. And so I would say that we're moving, not that it doesn't play a key role, the third party, the due diligence, the vetting, the questionnaires, but also, especially with a lot of our partners, we get a good understanding of the gives and gets that we've had with the partners over a period of time. And Janine talked about our changing business model, and the way that we're interacting with our partners is giving us more and more insight. So we're selling to our partners, we're selling with our partners, we're buying from our partners. And the big challenge that we have with the data right now is what we think our risks are right now, and what a lot of people in the room think risks are, the traditional discounts and the MDFs, at least in the technology space, is changing with these born in the cloud type partners that aren't relying on reoccurring software licenses. Really what they're trying to do is build on top of technologies, and it's just changing our relationship. What's important to them isn't necessarily as important as, or what's important to them isn't what was important to our traditional partners. And as our business moves that way, it just becomes even more and more important to rely on the data that we have directly with them.
I'd also add in to a specific dimension, like that we talk about the due diligence component, like just the general public information available about who you're doing business with. There are now more than ever, I think, tools both companies have internally and can seek externally to help you gain access to information that was probably never accessible before on a real-time basis. And so you can use technology, again, and data aggregation to pull on a daily basis, like know your vendor type, information. And so the more you can have depth in that, you will gain access to some of that information just by sort of the life cycle of how the internet works. Some of them now, in fact, look at ways to scrape the dark web. I don't even know how you would do that, and frankly, kind of freaks me out to think about. But it is like, those are now technologies that you can do. It's no longer sort of the days where all you have to worry about is like a PDF report that drives your due diligence. You can use these other tools that in some ways will help move past some of the issues you identified.
Yeah, so we're moving to continuous monitoring of web data. And we are, as Janine mentioned, starting to look at some of the dark web and relationship type mapping to get a better understanding.
Mike?
I second everything that's been said, particularly about the importance of scrutinizing what the third party is going to do for you. Things like, are they going to interact with governments on your behalf, those sorts of things. That information should be available to us. But then beyond that, just in the sort of traditional diligence field, you can always obtain business intelligence. You can engage the human elements of diligence as well. Obviously, it costs more, it takes longer time, but if the third party is deemed to be a high risk based on some, known tangible factors, then you can make that investment, and often we do. And so, that is essentially somebody with local knowledge, interviewing, speaking with people that have worked with the target of your diligence, with the third party, to ask insightful, meaningful questions about their reputation for integrity. So that's always available to you. I think many of us have also, just had the experience of asking the third party questions directly ourselves. Sanctions issues come to mind. If you're if you're leery about who really owns the third party, you can ask a lot of questions to figure out, who owns, whether it is 50% or more owned by a sanctioned entity. So that's something that shouldn't be discounted either. So I do think there are ways to overcome, the lack of sort of, in some cases, real-time information on suspensions or other legal proceedings.
Yep, excellent. So just to sum it up, try to find more data sources, look internally at data, because you might have it, ask the client questions, and finally, it wasn't added, but it's probably relevant, the lack of information probably is indicative of something as well. Sometimes it's the dog that doesn't bark in the night. If we don't have that, that might be something we could add to our risk rating algorithms to say, hey, this company didn't have a web presence or some piece of information that might increase its risk. So having said all that, I appreciate the time and the panel's time today, and you all listening to our presentation. And that's it for today.